journalist and documentary maker. I'm British-Iranian, and I was in Afghanistan about the same time, making a documentary about women under the Taliban. So for those of you who don't know Andrew, this is a little bio. Andrew North's an award-winning journalist and writer. He's reported widely from across Asia and the Middle East, spending several years in Baghdad as the BBC's resident correspondent and in Delhi as the BBC's South Asia correspondent. Andrew's been covering Afghanistan since the US invasion in 2001. He was based in Kabul for many years for the BBC, and more recently he's been writing about the country for The Economist. On his last reporting trip in early 2022, he was abducted and imprisoned by the Taliban. And that's part of the story in his first book, War and Peace and War, 20 Years in Afghanistan, for which he also has done all of the illustrations, as you can see here. So he's not only a great writer, it turns out, but a great artist. Andrew, why did you want to write this book?
Well, first of all, Ramita, thank you for that incredible introduction, and thank you everybody for being here, to Pramira for organising it as well. It's really fantastic to see this turnout, because we're still, the book is actually going to come out in July, so I'm still kind of just starting to get the word out about what's going to be in it. And the reason, so it's two stories, this book. It is the story of what happened to me and my colleagues in 2022, early 2022, when I was back in Afghanistan for my third trip after the return of the Taliban to power, and I was abducted and imprisoned by the Taliban, actually at a moment when three colleagues who I was due to be working with had also been taken the night before, and I was actually at that moment trying to find out what had happened to them when I was myself taken. So it's that story, but the reason that I really wanted to write this book is that I wanted to tell the bigger, wider story of why things ended up the way they did. 20 years after 9/11, why did it end up, when the Taliban had been defeated after 9/11, comprehensively defeated, why did it end up with the Taliban back in power again? And the way that, and we'll get into this in more detail, but the way that I tried to tell it, and another reason that I wanted to write this book, is that I've tried to tell that story through the lives and experiences of 5 Afghans that I worked with or got to know in the course of my reporting over the last 20 years. And it's not just their stories collectively sort of help to get at why things ended up the way they did, but not just after 9/11, but going all the way back. Some of their life experiences goes all the way back to 1978 and the coup, the communist coup that then led to the Soviet invasion. So I'm trying to tell the whole story of those nearly 5 decades of war, why things ended up the way they did, but focusing on the period since 9/11. So that's kind of that's the sort of the summary of the book. So.
Could you tell us a little about the 5 characters and why you chose them, why you particularly chose these people?
Right. So the book begins in 1996 at what was a critical moment when the Taliban took power for the first time, and it begins with the story of a man I call Abdul, who is someone I worked with very closely. And for his security, this is not his real name, but he is present at the moment when he's in Kabul. He is wanting to become a doctor, and he is there when the Taliban take over, and he happens to witness. And I'm glad to see quite a few Afghans in the audience. They will know this moment all too well, because he witnessed the immediate aftermath of the lynching by the Taliban of Mohammad Najibullah, who was the last leader of the Russian-backed or the Soviet-backed government. And he'd actually been under UN protection for several years before then. And it was a moment, the key, why this matters and why I kind of focused on his story first of all, is because in 1996, in September 1996, when the Taliban first took Kabul, it was just after they had gone through years of civil war. he and many others really hoped this moment was the end of the war. And he didn't know much about the Taliban. They came from the south. He thought, okay, now one faction is in charge. This is going to be at least security and law and order again. And then suddenly he comes across this gruesome execution. And he suddenly, in that moment, he then realizes that, the Taliban, as he says, that these people also are not good. And it's there that you're seeing how this is a rotating series of wars that then, of course, then leads up to 9/11, because then, in fact, Osama bin Laden came into Afghanistan separately to the Taliban. It wasn't, but the Taliban later treated him as their guest. But because of that instability that goes round and round and round, you get stuck into this repeating cycle of wars. And then, of course, we have 9/11, and then the Americans, come in. So
you've used an amazing cast of characters. How did the 2001 invasion affect your characters and affect the different factions? We were talking about the factions then. I'm particularly interested in the rival warlords. Can you tell me about them and which ones were co-opted into the new Afghanistan?
Right. Well, I think, first of all, let's just go back just a bit to that period. I remember when I first came to Afghanistan, after the fall of the Taliban, the first Taliban regime, and there was just, as again, Afghan friends in the audience will remember far better than me, that feeling of hope, because there was another moment, just like my friend Abdul felt initially in 1996, when people thought, okay, this time is going to be the end of the war, and this time the Americans are involved, the biggest, the richest country in the world, and they're involved on the ground, and hopefully they're going to turn things around. And we can finally look forward to the future that we have been trying to prepare for all these years. But of course what happened was that the Americans, and this is crucial to understanding everything that happened after that, the Americans came in, they had, as far as they were concerned, the Afghans wanted peace, but the Americans had come in effect, they were starting a new war. It was their war on terror. That's what they were concerned about. They weren't concerned about peace in Afghanistan. Afghans wanted peace. And therefore, as that was their priority, and to get to your question, they then allowed a situation, it's complicated, but to try and simplify it, they allowed a situation where all the people who were responsible for that civil war in the past, that had caused so much destruction, so much bloodshed, they were able to get back into power again, those warlords. And quite quickly, one, they of course started consolidating their power, but also it meant that Afghans were losing faith quite quickly in this new system. It wasn't the new order that they hoped for.
You talk about hope, and those early years when Afghans had hope, and they were so trusting of the British and American troops. When did you realise that this was starting to change, and what were the turning points, do you think?
I think, and hopefully we're going to have some questions afterwards, and perhaps there'll be,
we are,
different views on this. But I think, that some of that hope did live on, actually quite a long time. I remember covering the election in 2004, and with my colleagues that I talk about in the book. And even at that point, when there were already worrying signs about what was happening, there was still a hope. And the turnout for the 2004 election was incredible. It was nearly, I think it was 84, 85%. And this was when the Taliban they were already there, they had begun a new insurgency. They not nowhere near as deadly as they were later on, but they were already starting to mount attacks across the countryside. And people went to the polls after writing out their wills, but they were still determined to vote. They braved the Taliban threats to come out and vote. So that was definitely one moment, and then of hope, and then it carried on into 2005, 2006. But by then, you were starting to see the really important divisions being etched out between the cities and the countryside, because the Taliban insurgency and where the Americans had turned people against them was particularly in the south and the east, where the Taliban was their traditional recruiting grounds. And you started to then, looking back in hindsight, you can see how that was the moment when it was maybe too late to have turned things around. And the American mentality, the way they understood it, is crucial in that, because they didn't entirely understand what was going on.
I want to go back to the warlords that were co-opted into the government. Can you tell me about them and that trajectory and the significance of that?
Yeah, well, I think it's worth remembering that some of these so-called warlord figures, that became the kind of generic term for them, were at least as, and in some cases even more conservative than the Taliban in their approach to issues like women's rights. And I remember spending a lot of time out in Herat in Western Afghanistan, which had become the fiefdom of Ismail Khan, who was someone who was, he'd earned his reputation, his spurs, fighting the Taliban. He was a hero figure in his way, but he also had women were basically second-class citizens in the way that he ran his mini empire in Western Afghanistan. And also, critically, he was doing that because he had control of customs revenues coming over from the border with Iran. And he was kind of he was running Herat as a semi-independent kind of state. And so that meant that even at this early stage, when the US had overseen the Hamid Karzai's ascension as president, it meant that people could see the reality was that the people who held the power around the country, it was not Hamid Karzai in Kabul, it was these individual warlord figures. And he's just one example, and there were many others. And I think, and actually just one more thing to add to that, and I talk about this in the book, was that in the south and the east, which is where the Taliban had their main strongholds, the American priority, their priority of the war on terror, meant that they simply wanted to work with people who were going to go and kill Taliban. They didn't care about their attitude to women's rights or anything like that. The priority was hunting down Taliban. And therefore that also meant that you were not going to get the new governance, the new order that people wanted.
Afghanistan is a lesson in how Western intervention and foreign policy can get it catastrophically wrong. What do you think were the biggest mistakes that the West made?
I think now looking back, and look, hindsight's wonderful, isn't it? I think, and again, I'd be really interested to hear some of the views from Afghan friends and colleagues in the audience. But I remember being back on a trip there in 2019, several trips, which was actually the year when the last election, presidential election was held before the Taliban took over. And that election was a disaster in so many ways. The turnout was terrible, the security situation was terrible. But still at that point, no one was, and also the Doha process that led to this had already begun. Zalmay Khalilzad, the US envoy, was already starting his talks. But still no one thought the Taliban were going to take over again. There was still that kind of hope that somehow things would keep on going. But now, with the benefit of hindsight, the key moment that I think things were probably lost was all the way back in December 2001, because there was this really critical moment when the Taliban had been utterly defeated, and they made an offer and to Hamid Karzai just after, literally on the day that he had been appointed as the new interim leader. And they made an offer to surrender in return for not being pursued and for being allowed to live in peace. And they handed that over as a letter, and as far as we know, it wasn't signed, but it had the authority of Mullah Omar, the Taliban leader. But the Americans, for them there was no question of doing deals with the Taliban. They were the people who'd hosted Al Qaeda. Obviously, memories of 9/11 were very raw, and it was not in their mindset that, okay, let's try and have a peace process. They wanted to fight a war. And so that moment was gone. And then the Taliban later on, in the Doha talks, they later on said that was the missed moment.
How did they go from that weakened state to winning? So what happened? And on practical terms, how were they being funded? How were they so robust?
And I think, going back to there are many factors, obviously, about why things ended up the way they did. But another one is, I think, the failure to understand Pakistan's involvement and the reasons why it was doing the things it was doing in Afghanistan because of the views and somewhat paranoid views of its military establishment. Because the key thing that happened is that the Taliban were their offers were not taken up, but Pakistan, and this went all the way back. This is where it goes all the way back to the Soviet period, and even before that, Pakistan had this deep fear of losing influence in Afghanistan, and it had always tried to make sure that there was someone in power that was amenable to its interests. And its key interests, I didn't want India to have any major influence in Afghanistan, but it was also very concerned about the Pashtuns on either side of the boundary line that separates the two countries, separates Afghanistan and Pakistan, uniting to form what's called a Pashtunistan. It's complicated stuff, but this goes back. This is another important part of the history. This goes back to the British legacy, because it was the British that drew this line called, Afghans still refer to it as the Durand Line, which was the name of the British official who drew that line. They still don't recognise that border. Whereas Pakistan, in a way, understandably, has always felt threatened by that, because Afghanistan refuses to recognise their border. So, to sort of try and wrap this up, what that has meant is that Pakistan was always concerned about the potential security threat, and therefore it always played games in Afghanistan to try and make sure that it had influence, it had control. And so it backed various people that it supported during the Mujahideen rebellion against the Soviet invasion. And then when they didn't work out, effectively, and again I'm summarising here, that's when they then moved on to backing the Taliban. So if you bring things all the way back to the sort of the 9/11 period, after 9/11, Pakistan, again, despite the fact that they had said we're now going to back the United States in its war on terror, they were not happy with the way things worked out, because they didn't have in Kabul someone that they felt was entirely on their side and was going to defend their interests. And so they returned to backing the Taliban again. So, I mean, I'm giving you I know it's a long-winded answer to the question, but the key thing is, what happened is that Pakistan, for its own reasons, then decided to start helping the Taliban to rebuild again. And that was critical, because it meant that they had a sanctuary. And I get into this quite a lot in the book, in terms of Pakistan's role, and also talk about the experience of US troops. I was on the border with US troops who was kind of sometimes stuck in the middle of this situation where they were coming under attack by people coming from Pakistan, but their rules meant that they were not allowed to go into Pakistan to pursue them. And which actually was, regardless of what you think about the American presence or anything else. It was a ludicrous situation that they were then coming under constant attack from people who had a sanctuary. So if you're going to fight a war, then why would you leave a sanctuary like that? Then of course allow them to rebuild. Now, roll all the way forward to 2021, it wasn't just Pakistan's help, but that was critical in helping them to rebuild in those early days, and then get to the point where they were then a nationwide, strong force. That, in the end, let's face it, they won. They won.
At which point did you realise that they might win?
I think that the no turning back moment, and I suspect I'm going to keep doing this kind of because I'm interested in Afghan friends' view on this as well. But for me, I think the Doha deal was obviously really, really important because just to give a quick summary of that for those who don't know, this was the deal that was signed in February 2020 by the Trump administration. The Trump administration, oversaw it because Donald Trump wanted to get out, and that was basically a deal that said the US will withdraw as long as you don't attack us, but there was no guarantee. That still allowed the Taliban to carry on attacking Afghan forces, and there were a few other kind of conditions. But essentially, it was a U.S. withdrawal deal. Some people sort of talked about it as a peace process. It wasn't. It was just a U.S. withdrawal deal. But there were some conditions attached. And then when Joe Biden took over, he really didn't want to be in Afghanistan, and he made that clear for a long time. So anyone who hoped that he was going to change the deal was very quickly, that was very quickly shown to be misplaced, and he then turned it into an unconditional deal. And so I think once Joe Biden had said, okay, that was the 14th of April 2021, we're going home, then I think at that point it was clear that the Taliban had an open goal. But I think the final key moment when I was sure that they were going to take over was in early July of that year, which, as people may remember, was when the Americans, in the middle of the night, left Bagram Air Base, their biggest, most important hub in the country, and they disappeared. And then at that point, that sent the message that it's game over. And the Taliban were already on the march, but it was after that things really started to speed up. And then also, but the key thing was that already people were changing sides. But at that point, people thought, well, what is there to fight for? And it really started to speed up.
You said already people were changing sides. How much popular support across the country did the Taliban actually have then?
Look, it's very hard. It's very hard to know because, of course, they're an authoritarian religious movement who don't now and didn't then brook any dissent in the areas that they control. But this is where it also goes back to those earlier years where, heavy-handed US behaviour and also British behaviour in places like Helmand had turned people against them. They killed so many people, and they'd taken people on, into captivity. And so one of the other characters that I feature in the book is someone I first met in 2004. When he, at that point, was 13 years old. And this was in southeastern Afghanistan. And the reason that I met him and tracked him down is because he had been taken in an American raid in his district when he was 11 years old, and he was taken to Guantanamo. I mean, 11 years old, and he was scooped up in a mass raid where dozens of people were taken. And then somehow he ends up being taken to Cuba. And there he's interrogated about what he knows about 9/11. And he knew nothing about 9/11. At first, he didn't even understand why the Americans had come to his country. The first time, as he said to me, the first time I understood anything about this 9/11 business was when in Cuba they were showing him videos of the 9/11 attacks and saying, you know, who did this? So the reason, so I met him in 2004, just after he'd been released. And I then sort of tried to, you know, keep in touch and find out what happened to him later. He also wanted to become a doctor. Then his area is an area where there was traditionally quite a lot of Taliban support, but they were on the fence at that point. They hadn't decided which way they were going to go. And then I lost touch because it then became too dangerous to go to that part of the country for me as a Westerner. But then later on, 2 years later, and actually I finally confirmed it after the Taliban had taken power. I'd heard rumours, but he did join the Taliban. And he then became a kind of a local commander. And then of course, I was back again in Afghanistan after the Taliban fell. And on that third trip, I was going to meet him. And then, so that in the end, I had to sort of find out the rest of his story remotely. But the point is, this was someone who things could have gone another way, and he ends up joining the Taliban.
There's a beautiful moment in your book where you describe his father welcoming him back when he's been released from Guantanamo. Tell us about that. I found it particularly moving. How his father had reacted. That's right. And what had happened while he was in Guantanamo.
It was, it was actually one of those. It was one of those moments as a journalist when you realise that you have to be ready for the surprise. Because look, we went down. It was a very difficult place to get to. We drove down there in winter. This is in Paktia province in southeastern Afghanistan, and we found him eventually, and we were there to obviously, we thought, tell a story about how the Americans had a negative story for the Americans. Let's be honest, that the Americans had taken a young boy and taken him all the way to Guantanamo. But then, and what Ramita is referring to is that his father seemed to almost he was kind of proud of the way that his son had sort of survived the ordeal. But then he said, and this is all on camera. He sort of puffs up and he says, "Oh, this has been the making of him. He treats me much better. He's got much better manners now. He treats his siblings much better, he speaks some English now because he's learned a bit of English in Guantanamo. And then he said, look, and he's seen the world. He's been to Cuba." So it was an incredible moment, and then he subsequently goes on and tells us that he said he actually, and Nakibullah, the boy then said he almost missed some aspects of Guantanamo because they had later on, after initially treating him pretty harshly, and he'd been beaten up and slapped when he was initially in U.S. detention, but in Guantanamo he was later, he said, treated much better, and he said he'd missed the good food he'd had, and he said he'd been allowed to exercise, and he actually was saying he missed aspects of his time there. So.
And there are lots of incredible, wonderful moments like that in the book, Andy. It's a real joy to read. Why did the government fall so quickly?
I think like a build-up of all these kind of things that we've been talking about. It kind of was gradually corroding in front of us, actually. We just didn't necessarily, we didn't know that it was when exactly it was going to fall. But I mentioned, I talked earlier on about that election in 2019, and as you know, I've done some drawings in the book, and there's a drawing in the book that I did when I went to one of the polling stations when on election day in 2019, and it was really striking. And this was in a place called Charikar, just north of Kabul, on the Shamali plain, and not far from Kabul, fairly busy, bustling place. And I was there for hours, and no one came. There were no voters, and so the drawing I did was kind of just showing these two very dedicated female election workers waiting, hoping that voters were going to turn up. Because in the end, the turnout was, I think it was like 15% or something. And that was a kind of a message of how people had just lost faith in this system that had been created. And there was the corruption that had certainly sullied the government's reputation, the warlords that had been enabled back to power, and the sense that for those in the elites there was impunity, and obviously everyone knew that billions had been spent and things had not changed significantly enough, and at the same time, and that also then allowed the Taliban to gain ground. So but at that point, it was a divided country. You had, I think, possibly half the country, perhaps not half the country, but a very large proportion of the country was effectively in Taliban hands.
I want to ask you about that, the billions of aid money, because that's something that really strikes me whenever I'm there, that the minute you leave Kabul, you can't see development, you can't see any of this money. What happened to it?
Well, you see, so of course, and again, I talk about this in the book, because the Taliban, when they came into Kabul in 1996, they came into a destroyed, broken city. And the Kabul that I first saw when I first arrived in the country after the fall of the Taliban was still that broken city. In parts of Kabul was just a moonscape of rubble. And by 2021, the city that the Taliban marched back into then had been, rebuilt. It's not a perfect city, but it has certainly been, it is transformed from what it was 20 years ago. So there is some evidence now. Of course, some of that rebuilding was funded by drugs profits and all kinds of other things, but so some things have changed. But of course, the reality is, and this is why I think actually sometimes it's unfair that you tend to read a lot of coverage about just the corruption of the Afghan government. But there was corruption with everyone. There was corruption. Everyone who was involved, there was corruption. The way that the American system worked with the amounts of money that they poured in, that tended to encourage corruption. But of course, there were people who were, they were bilking the Pentagon. The American contractors were bilking the Pentagon with the way that they organized their contracts, and the money went back to the United States. And so that's where some of the money went, because it simply just got recycled back into the pockets. It was American taxpayer dollars. There were Afghans who made a lot of money out of that, but there were also lots of Americans who made a lot of money out of that. And so that's where a lot of the money went. Now, of course, some of the money did go into rebuilding some things, but then the war also then destroyed a lot of it. I mean, I remember doing so after the Taliban fell, after the fall of Kabul and after the Taliban were back, I did a couple of trips down to southern Afghanistan, driving the Kabul-Kandahar road. And the first time I did that road was just after it had been rebuilt with American money, American and Japanese money. And then you could drive from Kabul to Kandahar in I think maybe 5 hours at that point, which was just transformational, because suddenly the traffic was really flowing, and it was a really important moment, and then things like that did actually make a difference. But of course, as they lost control of the south, and there were I mean, no, it's almost too complicated to get into. There was corruption involved in some of the convoys that were going the way. But anyway, the Taliban start to attack it. They improve their techniques. They start to lay larger bombs along the roadside. And I remember driving that road in, I think, late 2021, and I think it took us then 20 hours or something to drive the same road that took 4 hours, 4 or 5 hours before, because it was just full of bomb holes. It had been destroyed by all that war.
So many people describe the Taliban now as kind of Taliban version 2.0, and they say that it's a much more sophisticated Taliban. What do you think? Is it different?
I mean, it is. They are more sophisticated. But I was talking to someone earlier about this, and yeah, that phrase Taliban 2.0 certainly got used in the early months after the takeover in August 2021, and it in a way almost more is more in wishful thinking than actual reality. But they are certainly much more sophisticated in terms of the way they use media. This is a movement that, of course, initially banned television. The Kabul lampposts, those that were still standing, were strewn with videotape because they were, and cassette tape because they were at that point they were trying to sort of rip out any technology effectively. So now, they're on the internet, they're using television and so on. They're appearing on television. Of course, they don't like women so much on television, but not entirely though. That's another subject. But anyway, where were we? This new Taliban. So I was talking to someone about this, and in a way, 2.0 thing. Actually, it's almost like they're Taliban 2+, because the current leader, Hibatullah Akhundzada, is in some ways trying to be more hardline than the founding leader, Mullah Omar, in the way that he is operating, and he, the restrictions that you've seen on women and girls, and that last minute. I'm sure you remember the moment in March 2022 when they were going to reopen the schools, and at the last minute, everyone has come. All these teenage girls are back at school, and suddenly they're told no, they've got to go home. And sometimes some performative cruelty to some of his announcements, and so it's a sense in which they're doubling down and trying to almost go back, even trying to be more pure than they were in the way that they implement their beliefs than they were the first time around.
And you've had quite an extraordinary insight into this new Taliban. I want to ask you about your kidnapping when you were arrested and detained. Can you take us back to what you were doing when that happened, where you were, and how it happened?
Yeah, so this is the kind of the outer story of the book, and also for, bizarrely, it was a moment that somehow encapsulated for me the kind of, the stunning turn of events, because, it was 20 years since I'd first set foot in the country, when the Taliban had just been defeated, and I end up I'm back in the country. The Taliban are back in power, and then I end up as their prisoner. And so, what in some ways it was very mundane. As I said, I'd done 2 trips before that after the Taliban takeover. I'd been all over the country. I had a Taliban issued press pass. That's what enabled me to go do that road trip that I talked about, driving around down to Kandahar, because there are Taliban checkpoints everywhere, and I showed my pass and everything. They knew who I was, they knew what I was doing, and so it was. And then I was back to do some more reporting on that 3rd trip in February 2022. But what had happened is that the night before I was due to arrive, 3 colleagues I was due to be working with had been taken.
Taken where?
Taken by a Taliban unit, and had been sort of taken, has been stopped. Then, yes, so 2 Afghans and one foreigner who were a photographer that we were due to be working together as a team. Andrew McConnell, and I'm not going to name my 2 other colleagues, but who we were due to be working together on a joint project. And I thought initially that there would be a resolution, we would be able to resolve this. I mean, it's complicated to get into all the ins and outs, but I thought that we'd be able to resolve this. And then when I landed in Kabul at that time, I was then in the process of trying to find out what had happened to them. When I was also, along with my another colleague, my driver at the time, and we were basically taken off the street, and we were just in the car, and suddenly there's a knock on the window, and we find ourselves surrounded, and they decided we were suspicious. Now, as I said,
so they must have been following you. Taliban intelligence.
Yes. And the thing is, as I say in the book, I could understand initially how we could have seemed. It was getting dark. How we could have seemed to be suspicious, and so they're now the de facto authority, and so they could legitimately be checking who is this pair. And my colleague had actually just prayed outside. Because it was getting towards sunset, and he'd just done his evening prayer, and so possibly that's why they saw us. Anyway, but the point is, they had no interest in finding out who we were. Of course, I showed my pass. That was just knocked out of my hand. My phone was grabbed. They climbed into the car and then made us drive to what turned out to be their local base. And very quickly we had lost control, and they had no interest in finding out why we may be there, and that's why it then turned into an abduction, because then I was chained up overnight.
You were chained?
Yeah, I was chained up overnight. I was accused of being a spy. And I tell this whole story in the book. And then the next day, myself and my colleague, we were blindfolded and then taken to what later turned out to be the Taliban intelligence headquarters. But of course, it's what was known as the NDS. So of course, it was the building that was previously occupied by the previous government's intelligence service, working with the British and American intelligence services, and I was in a basement cell, and that's when my cellmates then informed me where I was once my blindfold was taken off. And then obviously at that moment, I'm then thinking, well, they've got no reason to hold me, so this must be the beginnings of they're holding us just because we could be useful as some kind of bargaining material.
Were you scared?
Of course, absolutely terrified.
And
Because obviously everything had been taken off me, I had no means of communication.
How did you get the message to anyone? Did you manage to get a message to anyone that you were being held?
So yeah, so it's in a way it's an amazing story. So that this actually did happen. So because I was then interrogated by a Talib who spoke very good English, and he said to me, I'd learned all my English by watching American movies and watching YouTube, and he said it's very good to have a chance to practice my English with a real speaker. And
I mean, your description of your exchange with him is really quite terrifying.
Yeah, it was, and I mean, I don't want to give too much away, because I really love you all to go and buy the book.
It's really, really quite extraordinary. Give us a little taster. I mean. Yeah.
So I tell you one thing. He's a big fan of the American TV series Prison Break, and he was very disappointed when I had to confess that I hadn't seen it. So, and he thought, what's wrong with this guy? But there were these kind of absurd, sort of semi-humorous moments, but that particular interrogation ended up with him saying, looking up from his pieces of paper that he was writing notes on, saying, "You're going to be hanged." And obviously at that moment, my mouth goes dry. I don't know what to think, and I am then I'm for a long time I couldn't say anything, and yet sometimes as I think about it now, I'm surprised that I did it, but I guess I thought that I had nothing to lose. And then after he told me that I was going to be hanged, I said, well, I know my wife and children are going to be really worried about me and what's happened. Can you get a message to them? And somehow he agreed.
Wow.
And he agreed that he would make it on his phone. He made one phone call. So that's actually how the message got out to my wife Natalia of where I was.
What happened next?
So she obviously was astonished to get this call, and I was able to quickly say that he said the one thing, you can't say where you are. So I said we're okay, and I said please do all you can to get the word out to get us out of here, talking about all of us, because it was 5 of us who were inside. And then the phone line cut, because I think he used up his credit on his mobile phone. so that was it. But that then, and there's a whole other story which is not my story, of then Natalia's interactions and the campaign that she started to get us out, and that is, I am sure. So going back to my fear that we were being held for, that we were possibly being held for bargaining reasons. We are very lucky because we were eventually let out within a week, and there are people, of course, many Afghans who are being picked up in the same kind of way and then held indefinitely. And I was, in my cell. There were people who'd been there for a month on what seemed to be pretty, it was really hard to believe that there was any real reason for holding them. And there are Westerners who've also been held for much longer. So we're very lucky.
How were you released? Can you tell us about the negotiations that were going on?
So of course, I'm in my cell, and
Can
and
you
that's all I
describe
see.
your cell?
So
And
I'm
who's in it?
So yeah, and another reason why, in the end, it was also, while I was obviously terrified and I'm thinking of my own survival and how to negotiate this situation, but I'm also still, my journalist brain is still ticking and I'm still observing. And it also turned out to be, a fascinating sort of, now I'm able to tell the story, insight into the Taliban mindset. But also, it was, even in jail, there were other examples of one of the reasons why I love Afghanistan. And so just after this story, that when I was told that I was going to be hanged, and I'm thinking, no, they're not going to hang me. I can't believe this, and I'm back in my cell, just absolutely, just flattened, and just trying to work out what the hell I'm going to do. And this was in the first few hours after I'd been taken. And I remember I just slumped against the wall and I just was lost in my own thoughts. But I'm in a cell with, at that point, I think it was 12 other people, all Afghans. So my colleague Andrew was separate, was in another cell. We weren't all together. And there'd been a little bit of kind of chat between us, so they kind of knew a little bit about me in my my bad diary and so on. So we were able to converse. But anyway, so I'm sitting there just shocked and thinking, trying to work out what to do. And then one of my cellmates then indicates that I should take a mat and blanket, because we're all on the floor and there's not enough mats and blankets to go round. And I thought, no, I can't do this. And I said, no, don't worry, we'll share. We'll share our mats and blankets. And he insisted, and it was clear that they'd all talked amongst themselves and agreed that me, the foreigner, the Khariji, as Afghans would say, that I should get my own mat and blanket. And then he said, and then as I carried on protesting, he said, no, I insist, you're our guest.
So beautiful. I love that line.
Yeah. And that was, that is Afghanistan. It's like it's the kind of the flip side of Afghanistan's ferocious approach to invaders is fierce hospitality, and there it was.
Was there anything about that experience that taught you something about the Taliban? Anything that surprised you about them?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, and so going back to what I was saying about how it was an insight, my interrogator was very, very sharp and intelligent, and clearly, had learned a lot. And the reason I say that is because I think it was an example of how the outside world misjudged, how the West misjudged the Taliban. They had changed, and also, even though they were seen as a very rural movement, once I was back on those later trips, on those trips before I was taken, there were so many examples I came across that showed me just the extent to which they had infiltrated Kabul, and you would just come across people that had then come out as being Taliban, but they had previously been a university student and no one realised, and they had managed to build up this network. And I suspect that my interrogator was, of course I don't know who he is, but I suspect that he was one of those. And so those were things that told you how that they had the patience and they had built up this network because eventually they didn't know when, but they were going to take over as far as they were concerned.
Did that experience teach you anything about yourself?
Good question. Yeah. I mean, it did, because of course I was terrified, but in a way I'm also glad to say that I was able to kind of think, and because I decided that I thought I was going to end up there for a long time, from the very beginning, I started preparing myself for that. And so actually even I think the first day I was in the intelligence service basement cell, I started doing exercises, because I was thinking to myself, this could go on. And of course, they take everything off you, there's nothing to do. The only thing, there was a couple of Qurans and booklets of surahs on the window sill, and that was it. And so I was actually thinking to myself, if I'm stuck here a long time, so I'm going to read the Quran actually. So I was going to read the Quran in Arabic, and I was thinking, what else am I going to do with my time? So I don't know. It's in a way, it's a hard question to answer. But looking back, I'm glad that I was able to sort of have some presence of mind. But I have to qualify that by saying, look, I know how lucky we are, to get out.
Well, I must say, you seemed remarkably clear-headed, and you had real resolve, I think, when a lot of us would crumble. It was quite extraordinary reading about that. Thank you so much, Andy, for sharing that with us. It's a really, really amazing story. I'm going to throw it to you guys now. Questions. We don't have long. Get that whizzed past, by the way. It's 7 o'clock already, so I think we've got time for about 15 minutes of questions. Who wants to start? Yes.
Do we need to pass a microphone to you?
Okay.
Yeah.
Many development theorists would say that aid should be passed through government structures to strengthen those structures. But that fails so many times because of what you talked about, corruption. And Afghanistan's a good example. I was over there too, and I know how corruption was failing the administration. What would you have recommended in hindsight? How would we feed aid into the system? Or would we do it ourselves? Or would we administer the Afghans doing it locally? How would you recommend that it should be done?
It's a complex question. I think a lot of the problem began with once because initially, as I said, the US wanted to focus on its war on terror. The Bush administration in those days, they said, we don't do nation building, we don't want to get involved in nation building. But then they kind of decided they had to kind of keep things on track. But then once they started to go down that track, effectively they were trying to recreate things in their own image. And I think that a lot of that mistake was trying to effectively recreate a kind of an American Western model and sort of put it on top. And so that's where, of course, then the corruption started, was because then they brought in lots of people who paid them, huge amounts of money, and they wanted to make this project work, and then corrupt actors realized that they could make a lot of money from this. But there was never sufficient sort of agency given, I think, to Afghans to also make mistakes, because there was still the assumption that the right model was to try and be like the West. And I know, I'm sure, again, some in the audience, some of my Afghan friends and colleagues will have a lot more insight on this. And but I think it was that sort of assumption that the West had the best ideas, and the idea was to try and get that created as quick as possible, and then things will work, and that would be something that shouldn't, if ever this happens again, but it's not going to happen again in Afghanistan, then that would definitely be one lesson that should be learned.
Any more one over there?
Yeah, thank you, first of all, for the amazing story. One thing I was just wondering, given the abruptness of the US and coalition departure following the Trump deal and then kind of doubling down by Biden to get out of there, do you think that process could in some way have been managed better, that would have ended better for the people of Afghanistan, or by then was it so far down the road and given the misalignment of intentions that it was sort of way too late for anything better to have come out of it?
Yeah, it could have been managed a lot better. There's no question, because in effect, if you think about it, the withdrawal kind of started back because in 2009, President Obama ordered a surge. The US troops hit a peak somewhere around 2011 when there were around 100,000 US troops in the country. And then they started to decline kind of after that. And there was a key point in 2014 when it was declared as the end of combat operations, and the idea was that the Afghan forces were going to take the lead. But in effect, the withdrawal had already begun. And so the problem was that it wasn't sort of fully embraced, that was going to be a kind of full and final withdrawal. And then everything kind of speeds right the way up to that kind of key 2021 period. And the key announcement was when Biden announces a complete withdrawal in April 2021. And there was not proper planning for what could go wrong. And I always find this interesting because, I spent a lot of time in Iraq, and I covered the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. And I remember speaking to American officers then who, before Baghdad fell, and they would always use phrases like, say, "Oh, we always prepare for the worst case scenario," and which was bullshit, And this is what happened. They sort of talked, but they did not prepare for the worst case scenario. And so then it all, and then it was panic because of course, suddenly, the West is going home, and the last chance of protecting the gains and for people, especially people in the cities, the last chance was suddenly seemed to be to get to the airport and get on a plane. So no, they completely messed up their planning for that.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Not only for today, but for your kindness, support, and being a very good friend of Afghans, particularly Afghan journalists, for all the efforts you made. Of course, the factor overlords of the 2001, politically and economically, they gain power. And it has a direct connection with the corruption as well. Don't you think the lack of common view or strategic vision about Afghanistan among those countries where they have military presence in Afghanistan was also been one of the challenge? Because every country was feeling Afghanistan, where were their troops? So it's like so many Afghanistan was fit in one Afghanistan. Beside of that, don't you think in the geographically, geopolitically, where Afghanistan is located, it's been surrounded by all type of I cannot see any democratic states over there. It's mostly either military or there's no lack of civilian government. But on that area, where there's a different type of monarchy, especially Central Asian country, Afghanistan was a unique at the own stage, which is foreign-like to see. It is, I think, lack of understanding or not really taking serious what is going on in Afghanistan. But let me remind you one thing. Winning the Afghan hearts and minds, that was the President of United States promise, or one of the slogans they used for the people of Afghanistan. Beside of that, time to time they say they will not repeat the same mistakes after when Mujahideen took over power. But it seems like they did the same. What do you think? What is their position now? I can see now also they are engaged in Afghanistan, they are supporting Taliban, they are giving good money and lots of, let's say, diplomacy or engagement, and the name of engagement. What do you think? Because at the end, this is the people of Afghanistan, and particularly the women and girls of Afghanistan are paying back
They're
the
paying
price.
exactly, and that was, a lot of people ask, the question, well, is anything left from those 20 years? And of course, a lot is left in the way that people's minds were changed. But for women and girls particularly, of course, it's been a disaster, because the biggest period of improvement for the life and the rights and the welfare of women and girls was in those last 20 years, and it went from basically zero women, zero girls in school above grade 6 to somewhere around 3 million, I think, by the end. That is one of the terrible, perhaps the worst disaster of what has happened. And I think in the end, and this I think also goes back to the way that the US saw it, because in the end the US was not going to stay there, and it was never going to stay there beyond. It stayed there a long time, and so by failing to kind of build up a structure that could survive, that ended up being the biggest failing that then allowed the Taliban to come back in the way that they did.
I think we have time for one more question. Before we get to your question, though, I believe that the lady that asked the question is an MP. Should we?
Yeah, we should say that exactly. Shukriya Barakzai is a former MP in the Afghan Parliament, so she is speaking with a lot of authority on this particular matter. So yes, exactly. Yeah, remember covering one of your election campaigns. So.
Final question.
I mean, that's a lot of pressure, but I think one of the things that Anne had said was that we would perhaps hear from some of the Afghan voices. So if this is the last question, I'm happy to just seek ground. It's like any of the people that we thought we would hear from. No, really.
No, go ahead.
Oh,
go
all right.
ahead.
I mean, Andrew, I guess the question that I would ask, and the sense I've got from a lot of the questions is like the sort of invasion almost or the US invasion in almost kind of logistical terms of like, if this had happened, if that had happened, this was a critical moment, that was a turning point. But the kind of history of what we've seen in Iraq, Vietnam, Afghanistan, like, it doesn't work, right? It just fundamentally doesn't work. So how do you then, as someone who's seen so much of this, how do you think about the rationalizing logic of it? Is it just that, I come from India where they say the process is the punishment, right? So they're going to accuse you of something, and then you're going to spend 20 years fighting, and then eventually you may or may not be innocent. So is that how we kind of rationalize the American presence in Afghanistan, that it was kind of like a 20-year punishment? Because we're back to where we began, right? So how do you think about this? I guess it's not very coherent, but...
What was that last thing you said? Punishment? The word you said before, punishment.
I said the process is the punishment
right.
in some ways. So is that how one thinks about these long occupations?
Yeah, I mean, I think it should be a very clear message that not to mount this kind of operation. I mean, sadly, I'm not sure that these kinds of lessons get learned. Now, I mean, I think if you go all the way back to 9/11, there was no question that there was going to be an American military response, regardless of the reasons that had led up to that. I mean, I always remember talking to a former French ambassador to Afghanistan about this, and of course, you know, the French being sceptical in many times about American military operations, and the way he put it, he said, you know, those people who say there could have been a legal response to the 9/11 attacks. He said the idea that you could have had the district attorney for South Manhattan, which normally handles terrorism cases, you know, handle this one and prosecute this was obviously ridiculous. You know, there was going to be an American military response. In a way, and this is hindsight, but the tragedy of what happened in this case was that the Americans did have a chance to turn things around, because there really was that hope and sense that things could be different this time in 2001, 2003. Because this was not like what happened when the Soviets invaded in 1979, 1980. They were facing a rebellion from the beginning. But there was no rebellion at the beginning. And the Americans blew it. And you ended up with, you know, the situation that we have. So it could have been different. Could have been different.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Andrew's book.
I should talk about this.
It's going to be out in July. You can pre-order Amazon, Waterstones, W.H. Smith. You can pre-order from everywhere. And I've read a lot of books on Afghanistan, and really this is rather brilliant. So I urge you to go and place your pre-orders in and to buy this brilliant book. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Andy,
Ramita.
for sharing your stories with us. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you Pranvera,
Thank you, Pranvera.
for organising this.
Yes.